cool, deciduous forest of the Northeast. Mainly what? Sugar maples, red maples. The beech, which are gradually, as we all know, dying off. Some black cherry. Those were all the high canopy trees. Underneath, we had the American hop hornbeam, which all of us around here know as ironwood. Ever try and cut it down by hand? You know why it's called ironwood. And the hop hornbeam, which many of us call the blue beech, both small understory trees, along with, as you see on this opening picture, a lot of shadblow, which are quite wonderful for all sorts of reasons. There were a few ash here and there and a few red oaks here and there. And the Cornell boys, I don't know if any of them are listening. Ron, you listening? Back when they were 15, so that was quite a while ago, maybe almost 50 years ago now. Oops, sorry guys, told you your age. They planted as part of future farmers the southern edge of the woods with the Norway spruce. So that's my woods behind my house up here high on the top of a hill. Now, some of these trees, what's so amazing, especially the sugar maples and the beech, are more than 100 years old. So we have some biggies and we have some babies. Let's see, what are my notes here? Back in 2008, so that's what now, 13 years ago, I had been thinking about planting a wildflower garden in the woods, and that's the year I got started. There were 3 silver maples, you know those monsters that grow like 4 feet in diameter and about 4 or 5 feet above the ground, monstrous branches come off. Well, I had 3 of those back behind the house, and they were all leaning at a 45-degree angle towards the house. So I had my friend Joe cut them down and cut them up, and we split them, and I hauled brush and we put firewood aside, and that opened up to what you see here in front of you now, a glade in the woods, which is not quite as sunny as this particular April day makes it out to be, partly because to the right there are the Norway spruce, which are a good 50, 60 feet high, and they do cast a shade into the garden, which is on the north side of them. Let me see here, keep track of my notes. In 2014, another tree fell down, and that opened up the garden to more sunshine than I wanted. And so I planted 4 birch trees, a cornelian cherry, a hawthorn, and now, how many years later? 8 years later, they're about 15 feet high and filling out and replacing the shade that was lost. What we're going to be seeing here in a few minutes are basically spring ephemerals, meaning they're all perennials. They usually come from corms or tubers or what else? Bulbs. And they only exist above ground about 2 months out of the year. If I went out in the woods right now, 3rd week in March, they'd be coming up. They come up sooner now than they used to because of global warming. But as long as the sun is shining down through that deciduous woods, there's sunshine on the floor of the forest. And so if they can sprout their leaves, make their flowers, set seeds, and make enough food from their leaves to store in their corms, tubers, and bulbs, by the end of May, when the leaves have come out and now the floor is shaded, they just go dormant underground. So their existence above ground, this sounds like a Greek myth tragedy or something, is only 2 months out of the year. And the rest of the time they just hang out down below waiting for the next spring. There are a few wildflowers though, however, that will last all the way through to August. Now, just briefly, if you're interested in doing this, either in your woods, or if you have no woods, but you have a house where there's a north side, you can do it on the north side of your house in the shade. Here are a few hints. If you've ever tried to take a shovel out into your woods to dig a hole, forget it. The roots in the forest are everywhere, and it's just too frustrating. So what did I do? Well, if you can't dig down, you create beds above. And that's what I did. I created beds in my woods behind the house, anywhere from 18 to 4 feet long, 18 feet long and 4 feet wide, more likely ovals 5 by 3 feet, and a few circles 4 feet in diameter. Because my deciduous woods was fairly dense, I didn't have to do a lot of clearing of underbrush or weeds. So get your hoe, remove anything that's there, and then bring in, with a wheelbarrow and a shovel and a rake, you want to add 6 inches to your beds, because everything that I transplanted, nothing did I sow from seed, except the Jack in the Pulpits. We'll talk about that later. Everything was transplanted. So 6 inches is enough to get them started. And my mix was 1/3 good topsoil, 1/3 sand, and 1/3 peat moss. Some people will argue about the sand. Some don't like to use peat moss these days. So if you don't want to use peat moss, you can take a pile of leaves that have been sitting around for a year, leaf mold, use that. Use your precious compost. Use some manure that's been sitting out over the winter for a year and leached out to add that humusy matter that you need. So whatever you decide to do, that was my mix, and that has worked very well for me. So, and I did it all by hand with the wheelbarrow. You know, I had Roger McGraw deliver me a couple of yards of topsoil. It's much cheaper to go to a local contractor and get a load of topsoil than to buy it by the bag from a box store. And I just wheelbarrowed it in, and I dumped it where I wanted it to be. And then my grandson, Jordan, who may be listening to this, he was only 10 when I started, but he was pretty strong even at 10. And I had discovered in the woods there, the farmers before me, maybe the Cornells, maybe the Perkins before them before the Second World War, I found 2 piles of stone. I'm thinking is it called de-stoning my 10-acre hayfield in front of my house years ago, decades ago, and dumped the stone there at the edge of the woods in those days. By the way, it makes a wonderful home for chipmunks. My cat loves to sit beside the stone pile and wait. He hauled a lot of stones, and then I simply edged each bed, the 6-inch mound. It was like a burial site. With these stones to keep the soil kind of in place for the first 2 or 3 years till the root systems took over to hold it. And then you plant it, and preferably you do this in the spring. You really can do it almost any time of the year if you water properly, but it's easiest to do it in the spring. And then I mulched it. I had a pile of leaves that I had mowed up, and I sprinkled about 2 inches of this mowed up leaves on top, made it look really nice and neat. And for a few years, I naively thought, they're wildflowers. Why did I think the deer wouldn't eat them? Well, as you may know, deer do eat some wildflowers, especially the trillium. If you are aware of what's going on in the world these days, too many deer, less guys out hunting in the fall. We don't have the wolves here anymore to control them. So they're getting totally out of hand as far as the number of deer that can live without destroying the woods in which they live. This is an aside, why I got my name, Mrs. Webster. In my 10 acres, there's so many deer now here in the area that no maple tree, sugar or red, no oak tree, and no black cherry is regenerating, because they grow up the first year and the deer eat them down that winter. If they come again from the roots the second year, the deer eat them down. And so they're just not replacing themselves. And the irony is the deer don't like the beech, but the beech is dying off. So we have a problem with the deer, and they do chew up the trillium. And you've all heard, I'm sure, from when you were in school, don't pick the wildflowers. You pick the wildflowers and they die off. Well, maybe you can pick a trillium one year and the leaves come with the flower, and you've deprived the tuber from getting food for next year. So it'll be like the concentration camps in World War II. Perhaps that tuber can survive emaciated and come up again the next spring. But if the deer eat it the second time, or you pick it the second time, it's not going to make it to the third year. And this is definitely happening in the Appalachian Mountains down in the parks in North Carolina. The deer are decimating the trillium, among other things. So it's something to be aware of. So after 3 or 4 years, I decided, oh, drats, I have to fence in my wildflower garden, which is pretty annoying, but maybe you won't have that problem. So there are different ways to fence, different ways to use netting, and it works, but it's an extra expense. Finally, almost done here, guys. You need, as always, to know your plants. Just because it's, quote, a shade garden, anybody that's done any reading on shade gardens, quickly you're told, there are many kinds of shade. There is a deciduous woods that has sunlight through March and April into May before the leaves come out. There is a dapple shade. Certain trees, they just don't make very dense leaves or their branches are scanty. And so it's a dapple shade. There is perhaps the east side of something that produces shade. So it has morning sun. And then there is the real dense, dark shade usually found under evergreens. And that's the hardest to plant under. And I don't even try in that. That's not my garden. So what does your plant want? What does your garden provide? So you want to put your plants where they're going to be the happiest. So the one thing you have to consider is what kind of shade do they like? And the second thing is damp versus dry. There are some plants that actually will allow themselves to sit in water for a month or two in the spring, like the marsh marigolds. Most plants don't like that. Then there are a few plants that really do like it dry, which is harder to find in a woods, especially in the springtime, after the snow melts and things haven't had a chance to dry out. But realize one of the reasons these are ephemerals and most of them disappear by May, it's not just the lack of sunlight. The trees are the boss on the block, and they're the ones that hog the water. So once their leaves come out, any kind of moisture in your forest floor is going to be sucked up by the big boys, leaving the poor guys on the ground with not much water. So rather than fighting it, they say, okay, see you next spring. So know what your plants want as far of how much shade and whether they like it dry or damp. And then my last suggestion is, I'm fussy about color and leaf color, flower color, texture, etc. Sometimes the catalogs are a little deceptive. I'm sure you've all planted blue geraniums, and they're not blue, they're lavender blue. So maybe it takes a year for you to see what it really is going to look like in its setting with its neighbor. And you decide, they don't really go well together. I'm going to move it. My advice is move it by its second year, because the roots from those trees are going to fill in your wonderful bed. And once again, then your 6-inch high bed will be hard to dig in. So if you want to change things, do it by the second year. Okay, before we start, for those of you that would like to see the real thing, I'm doing 2 wood walks again. I think I've done this for 6-7 years now. Because of the virus, I'm going to limit the groups to 8. So you're going to have to call me And some of you know I don't have an answering machine. Do I hear you groaning? Yes, yes. So call me around dusk and I'll be in the house by then. During the day in the spring, I'm tend to be out in the woods or in my veggie garden. So I won't be around to answer the phone probably. But call me around dark to sign up. My phone number is, who has a pencil handy? 587-8437. I'm also in the phone book. The first 8 to sign up will be, we're going to do it on Saturday, April 24th at 10 in the morning. And then Sunday, May 2nd at noontime. So April 24th, a Saturday at 10 in the morning. And a week or two later, Sunday, May 2nd at noontime. Now, if I get more than 8 people that want to do it, I'll have another session later in the afternoon. So, and if you sign up, don't just not come, because we will have a wait list. So a day or so before, if you change your mind or something comes up, you can't come, let me know and I can get somebody on the wait list to be able to come. All right, finally, I'm done. This is a picture of my glade, probably in middle of April, maybe, with some of my shadblow, which are a lovely tree, all 4 seasons. And especially lovely for the birds because they make those wonderful berries. The other name for shadblow is a June berry tree. And they ripen in late June, early July, and they're all gone by the middle of July because they're really well liked. So now I think I have to go backwards here. Let's see what happens. Aha. I can't hear you, but you can guess what this is. This is the first thing, one of the first things that appears in my woods in the low spots, in where especially where the intermittent stream is from the snow melt and all the rains of April showers. And so there is a little stream through my garden, usually in March, April, but by the end of May, it's dried up, unless you have a really downpour in the summertime. And so when I first moved here 35 years ago, this is what I saw. In those days, it was probably in late April. And I assumed it was skunk cabbage. Of course it was skunk cabbage. It was green. It was growing in the damp spots. It was early. And it wasn't until, I'm embarrassed. It was years later when I was over with my friend Sam in his beautiful woods in Angelica along the creek, when I discovered the real skunk cabbage. So what was this? So I went and hunted up in a book, which I should have done and not assumed way back when. It's false hellebore. And it will grow 2 to 3 feet high with a funny nondescript yellowish green flower head on it. And I've been thinning it out a little bit to keep it out of my real wildflower garden that I planted, but there's still lots of it out there in the woods. So false hellebore. Now, once again, we'll go through the glade, which is now filling in shade-wise with my birch trees. Boy, this is bright. Okay. Obviously, in the real world, it's not this bright. I guess this was something to do with transposing my photo to the screen a few years ago when we put this together. This is called Spring Beauties. And I'm thinking it probably was Rima at the library. And Terry, if you're listening and you disagree with that, let me know. But when Terry does this with me, she's one of the few people I know that when she was in high school, studied Latin, can you believe? And so she insists I put the Latin name down. And I'm less hesitant to do that because I can't pronounce Latin and I don't know Latin. So, and since this program has no Latin, I'm guessing Rima did it with me. And I said, nah, we're not going to bother with the Latin. Now, the reason, of course, why do you want to use the Latin is that the Latin is the Latin is the Latin, no matter where you are in the world. Regionally, people have nicknames for things. We call these spring beauties. Now, I don't know what they call them in North Carolina. But these were in my woods almost everywhere. They're very low growing. They're one of the earliest things that pop up. They're basically white or very pale pink, or white with pink veins that make them look pink. And for a week or two in the spring, usually 2 weeks, they're very low to the ground. There's just a sheen of pale lavender pink throughout the floor of the forest. It's really quite beautiful. So these are everywhere, and scattered here and there are trout lilies. What's their other name? Dogtooth violet. But they're not violets. They are trout lilies. Let's look here, a close up. I tell you, the older you get, the harder it is to get down and get a picture when you want to be 4 inches above the ground. Take a look at the leaves. You see why they're called trout lilies. Trout have a speckled back on that fish. And trout lilies are interesting. You hardly ever see them for sale in the catalogs because it makes a seed, drops the seed, and these are, let me think, these are bulbs. The leaves make bulbs. And every year, the little tiny bulb gets a little bigger and goes an inch deeper into the soil, creeps downwards. And after 7 years, it's gotten big enough and deep enough. And until that point, it makes one leaf only. And in my woods, especially in the southeast part of my 10 acres, there are lots of one-leaved trout lilies and no lilies out there. So after 7 years, at least, and the bulb gets big enough, then up come 2 leaves and it can make a flower. And the ones here on the northeast forest are always yellow. Don't try and dig them up. It's really, once again, you can't dig easily in the forest, and you got to go down 8 or 9 inches, and usually it won't work. Now, these are one of my favorites. And for a while, I thought I had a few of these scattered here and there in my woods. Turns out, no, it was I'm going to call it a cousin of these, Dutchman breeches. Now, take a look. This happens, I actually got a good picture of this. They look like a pair of pantaloons, like the Dutch wore 300 years ago, hung upside down on a wash line. And the leaves are very soft, almost like a blue-green, very ferny. And they grow from corms, like crocus. And these are, by the way, these are all ephemerals, these first ones we're looking at, which means they're only going to be around for 6 to 8 weeks at the most. Now, I don't know, the next one, I got most of these from Debbie McCrae. Over like a 3-year period, she graciously dug up a clump every year when she thinned out her very densely planted beds. These are the Virginia bluebells. And I like these, and by the way, this is a homework assignment, anybody that's curious. There's certain plants that start out with pink buds. And then as the flower opens, they turn to this beautiful, beautiful blue. So you can see some of those pinkish buds in the background, and then the beautiful Virginia bluebells in full bloom. Now, why this is, I don't know. I suspect it has something to do with chemistry, but we should research it just out of curiosity. Now, I'm going to pop forward a minute and then we'll back up. These are the leaves of the sharp-lobed hepatica. We, in our woods here in New York, we have both the sharp-lobed and, you can't really see these, the round-lobed. And I remember years ago, and this is like, at least 40, 45 years ago, when I lived in North Hornell, climbed the hill behind North Hornell on the east side, back in the day when I could climb a steep hill, going probably from 800 feet to, or not 1,000 feet to 1,800 feet, pretty steep hill. But you get to the top and it was flat and it was covered by mostly an oak woods. And I swear that the whole floor for acres and acres was covered with the hepatica. I don't know if it was round or sharp-lobed. I'm hoping it's still there. The woods is still there, and they haven't built up there They haven't really logged, I don't believe, up there. So I'm guessing that it is. This, of course, hepatica is one of the best loved plants that we can grow in our wildflower garden. Do I have one more? Okay, can they see that with that green band there?
I can see it.
Okay, so that green band doesn't show on theirs? Okay. This one I ordered through a catalog. The others I got some from, once again, from Sam's Woods and from a nursery down in State College. But this one I ordered through the catalogs, and it's more common, I believe, or maybe only wild in Europe. And hepatica can be white or pink or blue. And this one was a blue one. And I've had it for, I don't know, 8 or 9 years. It doesn't get much bigger, but it hasn't died off on me. Now this is what I had scattered in my woods that I thought with that, because I didn't bend over to look at it carefully, and I thought it was Dutchman's breeches. Well, it's not. It's squirrel corn, and the difference being, instead of the breeches hanging upside down, it's basically a heart shape. And the reason they call it squirrel corn is the corms are very tiny, like the size of a pea, a small pea, and they're yellow. And they grow close to the surface of the ground. So these are scattered, once again, not very numerous, but here and there in small clumps in my woods. Now, wait a second, what am I doing? Oh, yes. This is one thing that I can't seem to make grow in my woods. It's not happy. Twice my friend Wayne Wells from Discussion Group generously gave me a clump about this size of wild ginger, which, by the way, you can take the root and clean it up and slice it up and cook it up in sugar water, a syrup. And it's very good in cookies and cakes. So just munch on it, although it's a little sharp. And they're supposed to do marvelously well in full shade. They do have problems with slugs, and I'm thinking maybe that's why. I've tried twice in 2 different places. I can't get it to grow. Maybe it does, and maybe the slugs, when I'm not looking, they always do it when you're not looking, it disappears. Now, this is one of the few plants in my woods that's not indigenous to the Northeast. It comes from the West Coast forests up in Oregon and Washington, I believe, and it's called twin leaf because the leaf is in 2 parts. And I really don't grow it for the flower, which is a fairly small, inch in diameter at the most, white, very early in the spring, very small, inconspicuous. But in a good year with plenty of rain, these leaves will get to be over 1 foot in diameter. If it's a drought years, they may only grow 6 inches. So it makes a wonderful foliage plant, twin leaf. Now here, I'm sure, is one of my favorites and everybody's favorites. We're going to have to wait a couple of slides to see the leaves. I should have put them in slightly different order. The very first wildflower garden I had was many years ago, 50 probably, in Indiana, when we lived in a housing development. And right in my backyard, over the fence, was a primal forest that had trees that were hundreds of years old. The beech trees were 4 feet in diameter, and it was owned by Earlham College, a Quaker college in Indiana, Richmond, Indiana. What a treasure. And anyway, I did take a few plants to put into my backyard. And one of them was the bloodroot. And I still remember that first bloodroot there probably in those days in Indiana, which was warmer, probably in March. It's a lovely fragile flower that often, it's one of the earliest to bloom, but often the petals only last 2, 3, 4 days, get a good rainstorm, and they tend to fall. As soon as they're pollinated by the bees or whatever pollinates them, the leaves fall. And so they're very, very ephemeral. briefly in passing. Fortunately, they have gorgeous leaves that last all summer long. We'll see them in a few minutes here. I think Hope gave me about a half dozen years ago, but I don't know, they just didn't seem to thrive and they died on me. And I got others from other places over the years. There's something that's about, at the most, probably only 1.5 inches, at the most 2 inches in diameter. And this is quite rare. And I'd like to thank Dr. Race for these. It's a long story. Jim Horn had some of these double bloodroot in his garden. I said, Jim, where did you get these? He said, oh, I got them from, and I'm going to forget. Oh, Russ's, who used to drive the school bus for my kids at Alfred Alman, who lives in Wellsville now. He said, I got them from Russ. So I went to Russell Allen. Oh, I got them from Dr. Race. I don't have enough to give you, but maybe Dr. Race does. So you see, you're like a detective. So Dr. Race lives here in Alfred, and I went, and sure enough, by his back door, there was a very crowded bed. He said, oh, MaryLu, I'm too old to take care of them anymore. Here, you take a few. So once again, over 3 years, I went back twice and got a dozen each maybe, and they love it. Some things you bring to your garden, they don't love it, but some do. And this has multiplied. And the interesting thing about the double bloodroot is that it's sterile, which means nothing pollinates it, which means the blossoms last sometimes 2 or maybe even 3 weeks if the weather is good, cool, not too windy. So whereas the real original bloodroot is gone in a few days, you'll have these for a few weeks. And this is the leaves of the bloodroot. And what's so fascinating about them, in the cool weather of late March, early April, when the flower stalk comes up, the leaf is wrapped around it sideways. Take these leaves and stand them upright and then wrap them around the stem and the flower. It's like a cloak. And then if the sun comes out and it's warm enough, the leaf opens up and the flower opens up. But at nighttime, when it gets cold, the petals tend to close up and the leaf tends to come and surround and protect it. Also, it's one of those wonderful leaves that's a bit, waxy. And so when there's dew or raindrops, it's quite beautiful, like these little crystal drops sitting on top of this gray, blue-green leaf, which, by the way, lasts most of the summer. Now here is an expensive, and I mean expensive, thing that didn't work. But the conibells have a fascinating story. You have to go back. Now, I'm going to forget my dates, but you can look it up online. It was either in the late 1700s or the very early 1800s. And I think it was John Bartram, one of those first botanists in our country that tromped around our virgin forests, finding all these spectacular plants that they had never seen in Europe. And he came across, I think in North Carolina, somewhere in the Appalachians, this relatively small colony. In other words, the range of conibells was very small. And he found them, and I'm not sure if he named them, and then they got lost for like 40, 50 years. Nobody remembered where they were. And so for 40 or 50 years, they were off, nobody knew. And then they were rediscovered. And maybe that's when they were named, I'm not sure. You need a very, very acid soil for these. And they were very expensive, like $25 for a tiny little plant. And I bit the bullet, I bought 3. They lasted about 2 years. I did everything right, I thought, proper acidity, proper whatever, but they just weren't happy. So they no longer exist in my garden. Okay, what would a woodland garden be without a little lichen? Now, this is where Terry would be great with her Latin if she could figure it out, but who knows? I have no idea what it is. I just call it lichen, which it grows on its own, on the stone. And this is a beautiful kind that I have here in my woods. And what's neat about lichen is that lichen has been around for 300 to almost 400 million years. So it was one of the first plants that began to what? Cover up the barren earth. And the same thing I said about lichen goes for moss, only it seems like their Latin names are even longer and harder to pronounce. And most moss have no common names except one, pincushion, because it looks like a pincushion. And it tends to grow on an exposed root from a tree, especially the spruce trees, seems like. So I had to put that in. How are we doing on time? Am I taking too long?
15.
What, we have 15 minutes left? Ooh, okay, only 15 minutes, we'll zip through. This, once again, has a long Latin name, but we call it false lily of the valley because the leaves look sort of like lily of the valley. And this is a ground cover that creeps along, and in May has these tiny little balls of tiny little white flowers. And the green leaves last all summer long. And here, of course, are the trillium. Now, there are lots of different kinds of trillium. This is, I believe, for our area, the most common. And as it ages over, say, a week and a half to 2 weeks, maybe, the white will gradually fade to pale, raggedy looking pink color. But this is the grandiflorum, or large white trillium. And you can't really see it, that maybe down here in the lower right-hand corner. The flower sits on a short stem, which puts it an inch or so above the leaf, the 3 leaves. Some other trillium, the sessile ones, the flower sits right smack on the top of the leaves. This one's only about 6 inches high, and I ordered it from a wildflower nursery in North Carolina. But this was my most successful one that I brought in from outside. Like those Allegany bells, Trillium luteum sits right there on top of the leaves, which, by the way, tend to be mottled when it's of that type. These also come from an area in North Carolina. However, they are hardy up here in the north. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes if they come from down south, they die up north, but not these. Now, I'm sure you have seen these wild geraniums. They tend to grow in especially morning sun. So you'll find them along the edges of the woods. And I want to point out here, most people call those things you buy in the hanging baskets or the pots, the red geraniums. They're not geraniums, they're pelargoniums. But somehow they got called geraniums and that name stuck, even though it's incorrect. These are true geraniums, and they're the wild kind, and they're quite lovely. And they bloom also in May, a little bit later. And it can be anywhere from a soft lavender to a darker rosy lavender or more of a blue. So their color variation varies. And there's my jack. Now, once again, sorry guys, I could not get down on my belly. I mean, I could, but I couldn't get up if I did, to take a real picture of the jack. So I had to stand over it, and you're looking down on it. And even though we're running short on time, I got to tell you about the sex life of the jack and the pulpits. They grow from tubers. And once again, for a couple of years, as the tuber gets larger and larger, it sends up every spring only one stem with 3 leaves. And it's a male plant. You know, if you looked at its chromosomes, it's a male plant. And eventually, the tuber gets big enough, fat enough, has enough energy in it. It changes into a female, sends up 2 stalks, 6 leaves, and the jack. And the flower is inside the pulpit. And what happens is, by August, if it's been pollinated, the space is filled with maybe 50 little red, small pea-sized red berries. And I don't think they're really berries, but I'm going to call them that. Usually the chipmunks and the squirrels eat them up before you can get them. But I have one by the house, and usually I find one in my woods. And so I pluck it And then I don't do anything fancy. You're supposed to do some fancy stuff with the little red berries, but I don't. I just take them to a nursery in the woods in my garden and separate them out, spread them out about an inch apart, and then cover them with maybe half an inch of leaf mold. And then either put a flat, thin stone on top for the winter or some chicken netting that's fine, 1/4 inch, over them so that the squirrels and the chipmunks don't find them, and they will sniff, sniff, and eat them up. And then you got to remember, especially if it's a stone, come the following April to take that stone off. And sometimes it actually takes 2 years before they sprout. But I've had luck growing baby Jack and the pulpits. And then after usually the second year, when they're a little bit bigger, then I transplant them to where I want them to be. Alrighty, this was another kind of expensive. I couldn't resist. You know how that is, the catalogs come in January. And so this is a Jack in the Pulpit that comes from Japan. And it's the top part of the pulpit is more upright. So you can see the beautiful white space and the white inner part of the tube. The space in the middle there is the true flower. This has chugged along pretty well for about 8 years, 9 years. And now I think it has died. Now, I don't know, maybe that's its life expectancy. Some plants do live longer than others. This is a plant that likes a little more sun than shade. And why do we call it a fall strawberry? Look at the leaves, which look very much like strawberry leaves. And as my master gardener friends know, I'm not really that keen on yellow stuff in the garden, but these make a great ground cover. They're very dense. They're low growing, I don't know, 6, 8 inches high. And they do have yellow flowers in probably May, I'm thinking. And if you have a more sunny than shady spot, they'll do just fine. And here's our marsh marigold. Now, you know, they really shouldn't be in this program because they need sunshine. So we're not even going to talk about them. We're running late on time. We're going to skip on to one of my favorites, Husitania, or bluets, Quaker ladies. Pale, pale, pale blue, 4 cross-like petals with a yellow center. Sometimes they're white. The first time I remember seeing them en masse was on a trip in May, I think, to Boston, from Albany to Boston, Interstate 90, the Mass Pike. The whole left side of the road facing south, the north side of the road with the slope to the south, for 100 miles, just a haze of this beautiful blue, tiny little bluet flowers. Jim Horn gave me a clump of these, Solomon seal. They're quite tall, 3-4 feet. And I don't know, maybe it's because they're really in a shady spot, they tend to droop over. Maybe if they had more sunshine, they'd be more upright. And we're almost getting to the end. Rex, who used to be part of our original, we're almost to the end. Our original Master Gardeners guys, once he and I went for a hike around the lake there, Rushford or Cuba Lake, I forget which, where he had a cabin, and we found these star flowers. I think they're called that because of the 5 leaves that look like a star. Once again, it's a tiny little white flower, but the whole leaves are nice. I brought back a small clump. They're very fragile stemmed, but they love my garden. And what they do is they're runners right under the pine needles and leaves, just are slowly spreading, not densely. They spread out like the Navajo. They don't like living right next door to each other. They want plenty of space around their homes. So that's the starflower. And the final one, I loved this, bunchberry, a member of the dogwood family. Take a look, the leaves look like dogwood leaves, so do the flowers. However, this is a zone 2 plant. And the literature said, well, if it's getting too warm, it probably won't make any berries. And I'm sorry I don't have a picture of the scarlet red berries, a cluster there in the middle of where the white flower is. I had these on the north side of my house, and they're very acid loving. And for years they were fine. We were zone 4, and they were fine. And then 2 years ago, something happened. I don't know what. They died out. I didn't have a big clump. I'm guessing, what is it, Jeremy? The anthracite or something like that that's killing dogwood now throughout the Northeast. Or maybe it just got too hot. Who knows? But I have lost them. And since we are definitely getting warmer, I have decided not to replace them, even though they were one of my favorites. So Jeremy, that's the end of my talk. How do we open up questions?
So you are all more than welcome to unmute yourselves here. I will open up the chat so MaryLu can read any written questions.
Okay,
that
now
you may have.
if there's no picture, does that mean they're not on?
Nope, they're all here.
Okay.
Yep. And we're just going to open this to everyone. All right, does anyone have any questions?
Hi, are there any nurseries you recommend?
Yeah, who's this? Who said that?
Susan Steer.
I'm sorry, who?
Susan Steer.
Susan.
Susan Steer?
Yep. Okay. Let me see. I wasn't expecting a question like that. Plant Delights, which is from North Carolina, is a real specialty wildflower nursery. But you know what? Instead of doing it now, I'll go over some with Jeremy, and can you email them the list? Mm-hmm. Okay, because there's 5 or 6, but off the top of my head, I'm not going to be able to get them correct. Okay? Is that all right? Why don't I hear anybody?
Sure.
Oh, okay. So Jeremy has.
Thank you.
Jeremy has your email. In a day or 2 or 3, he'll send you a list.
Okay.
Jordan, are you listening? Call out my grandson, who helped me with the Woodland Garden over the years. Okay. Anybody else?
Let's see. It says on the bottom right, there's a question there from Glenda, but I can't read from this far.
What? Besides Trillium, what others are loved by deer? Oh, Once again, I'd have to think about that. The Trillium are obvious because they do just chomp down the whole thing. And so I guess I've done some, what would you call it, proactive, where if the bed is not that large, maybe like 4 feet in diameter or 5 feet, I will get 4 sturdy stakes. I have some metal rebar, and I will put it in the 4 corners. And then I have this nylon netting. I assume it's nylon netting. That's a 1/4 inch diameter spacing, like bird netting. And I just stretch it taut over those 4 stakes and let it drape down the sides. And so far for years, that has worked. They won't eat it. They don't poke their nose under it. On some of my other things, once again, I'm not sure, but I don't want to risk them, my more expensive stuff, like the double bloodroot or some of the other things. I can use metal fencing that's rigid, anywhere from 2 to 3 feet high, and you cut off like a 6 or 8 foot length, and then you make like a Quonset hut shape over the bed. And I suppose they could poke their nose under and flip it off, but they haven't yet. And sometimes I just put a circle around, 3 or 4 feet high, if it's like only 3 or 4 feet across. And so that seems to deter them. But I have more trouble with them eating, my shadblow and the young maples and cherry trees. Everybody's quiet. Well, it must be getting time too, right? What time is it, Jeremy?
Just past.
Have we gone an hour?
We're about to just hit the hour right now, it looks like.
Okay. So remind me now, I'm going to make a list of 2 or 3 or 4 wildflower nurseries. one in Texas is mostly seeds, and White Flower Farm up in Connecticut does lots of plants, but also some ferns. By the way, I really love my ferns. So if you come to the second Woods Walk in May, the ferns always come up a little bit later in the spring than some of the wildflowers. So I don't know, that might even be a little early for them. Once again, you never can tell. Some springs come a month early and some come a month late. So it always varies as to what's going to come up when, but they do come up in the same sequence. And if you're interested in this sort of thing, go look up Thoreau, the guy that went out and lived for 2 years and hoed beans, remember? He kept a diary for like 10, 12, 15 years. Every spring he would walk around the pond and he'd list when things bloomed and the order they bloomed in. And that's how one of the reasons we know of global warming, because things in the Northeast are blooming anywhere from a week to 2 weeks earlier. One last tangent thought. My snow crocus, when 30 years ago, when we were in zone 4, would bloom early April, and the very first sunny day they opened up, the honeybees would be there, like they were in sync. Somehow the honeybees and the crocus knew when each was going to be there. Now, this year, the snow crocus opened the first week in March, and the bees didn't show up until 3 days ago. So they're no longer in sync. And this is creating a problem, not only for the bees and food, but the same thing is happening with birds who migrated north, like the warblers, when certain, I'm going to call them bugs, sorry guys, hatched out as larvae, worms, and they were all in the trees. And the warblers came through and they could feast. Now it's not happening at the same time. And so we're really running into some problems like that. So where did that come from? Oh, you might want to start keeping track of what blooms when in your yard. And of course, my snowdrops on the east side of the house, south side, bloomed 2 weeks earlier than the ones on the north side. So that will happen in your woodland garden also. If it's shadier, a plant will bloom later than if it's in the sun. I'll also make a list for Jeremy of the easiest plants to find in Friends Woods or in the ditches and that are easy to transplant. I've tried trailing arbutus 3 times, twice from a nursery and twice from a Friends Woods. And it's never lasted more than 3 years, even though I, quote, did everything right. So some things just don't want to be moved. And I'm sure Deb Bigelow would say, it's all those fungus under the ground. That's why you can't transplant them. So on that note, Jeremy, you want to close it down?
Before we end the questions, anyone, I had mentioned MaryLu, if any of you are interested in starting your own forest garden, if you have any questions pertaining to that, now is the time to ask. And if not, we can wrap things up here and let you guys go.
Thank you, MaryLu. That was wonderful.
All right. Hey, Mary, I got some plans for you. We got to get together. And Carol.
Sounds good to me. I'm only down the road.
All right.
Awesome.
I'll
Very
call you
helpful.
over the weekend.
What's that?
Yeah, it's great.
Who was that? Susan.
Hi, Susan.
Okay.
It looks like that's everything. Awesome.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much, guys. I'm going to close up the stream here. I hope everyone enjoyed.
Oh, wait a second. Are they still there?
Some of them.
Maybe next month we're going to do one on the shade garden. If Jeremy wants to work,
Yep.
I've got another PowerPoint on the shade garden. So
I'll let everyone know that attended for this one. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Thank you for joining us. And we'll get those lists out to you a little bit later. Okay, goodbye.